The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show, the home of geek, folklore and paranormal entertainment, with me, Charles Christian, as once again we delve into the worlds of weirdness, urban myths, history, geek culture, ghosts, magic, witchcraft, the occult, and anything else I think will intrigue you. This week, our interview takes us into the realms of paranormal warfare, or psychic warriors and spies, as we hear about the American Stargate project to investigate remote viewing. You can find the full background in John Ronson's 2004 non-fiction book, The Men Who Stare at Goats, not to be confused with the 2009 George Clooney movie, also called The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is more of a dark comedy about US Army Jedi warriors. Our guest is Dr. Paul H. Smith, the longest-serving controlled remote viewing CRV teacher active today, having begun his career as an instructor in 1984. He served for 7 years in the US government's Stargate remote viewing program at Fort Meade. Starting in 1984, he became one of only 5 Stargate personnel to be personally trained as remote viewers by the legendary founders of remote viewing, Ingo Swann and Dr. Harold Puthoff, at the SRI International Center. Dr. Smith was the primary author of the US government RV program's training manual and served as a theory instructor for new CRV trainee personnel, as well as source recruiting officer, unit security officer, and unit historian. He is credited with over 1,000 training and operational remote viewing sessions during his time with Stargate, and currently Dr. Smith continues to teach classes in remote viewing and is the author of a number of books, including Reading the Enemy's Mind and The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. Great pleasure to be talking to Dr. Paul H. Smith, and the subject is remote viewing. Now, before we go into more details, for people who aren't familiar with the concept of remote viewing, what exactly is it?
Remote viewing is a skill that capitalizes on an underlying human faculty that all of us possess. You might call it the ability to experience, perform extrasensory perception. So in a very rough way of speaking, remote viewing is a psychic skill. Mm-hmm. It was developed during the Cold War for the U.S. military and used to spy on whoever the bad guys might be, whether that's the Soviets or the Chinese or the Hezbollah or whoever it might be. During that period. It's I guess you could describe it maybe most loosely as a sort of a disciplined form of clairvoyance, although it involves the other sense modalities as well. And now the irony here, of course, is that when I say sense modality, your senses aren't involved. That's the idea of extrasensory perception. You have perception that doesn't actually use the physical senses, and yet it comes through as if it was a kind of sensory experience.
You mentioned the Cold War. Now, there was a project called, the US government ran, called Stargate. Was that? Yeah. Tell us a bit more. Tell us a bit about that, or what you're permitted to say about that.
Yes, actually, I can say a whole lot more about it these days because most of it's been declassified. Stargate was the overall nickname, project nickname for a whole collection of of projects involving U.S. government use and research into of ESP type phenomena. I was a member of Stargate in a couple of its previous incarnations before it got the name of Stargate for 7 years. And in fact, I was literally, and I enjoy shocking people by saying this, I was literally a psychic spy for the Army and then later on for the Defense Department.
Sadly, you can't put that on your CV.
Oh, who says I can't?
Now, I suppose one of the things is anything to do with extrasensory or psychic powers, however you want to describe it. To most people, that means you've got to have the gift. You've got to be special of some sort. But I believe it's possible to teach people how to do this, or you can train how to do this.
Well, what I like to say is that you do have to have a gift to be psychic. You do have to have a gift to be a remote viewer. Only it's a gift that everybody actually already has. So the bottom line is, yes, you can teach nearly anyone to do this. And generally speaking, if they apply themselves, learn the right principles, and then do the requisite amount of practice, they can become pretty decent at it. I like to use the analogy of playing the piano or playing the violin.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I can't play the piano. I just don't have that gift." And my answer is that's baloney, actually. The only reason you can't play the piano is that you chose to do something else with your time than learn how to do it. Now, that's not a kind of condemnation. Each of us has our own interests and priorities in life. Mm-hmm. But it is kind of a rejection of this idea that you can't do something because you don't have the talent. Anybody can learn to play the piano, assuming they've got all their digits, right? Yeah. Anybody can learn to play the piano if they have a decent teacher and if they practice regularly. And you may not become a concert pianist, you may not become famous in that world, but you can at least learn to play it competently to the point where people don't mind listening to you, you can accompany somebody else playing the guitar or singing or whatever. And for most people, that's actually all they really want to do anyway, is to play at a competent level, not an exceptional level. And the same thing applies to remote viewing. If you do have a decent teacher and practice what you learn, ultimately you can be competent as a remote viewer, pretty much across the board.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what about you then? Your involvement with the military, how did that come about? Did you realize you had these powers, or did they say, you're enlisted, would you like to volunteer for this experiment? Or
I thought I was psychic as a brick, as the saying goes, and I had never put remote and viewing together. I never put those two words together. Never heard of it. I'd been in the Army by that time. I was a captain. After having enlisted and got up through sergeant, I went to officer candidate school and became a captain. Did a tour over in Germany, and so I don't know. I guess I'd been in maybe, I'd have to do the math, but 6 or 7 years by that point. And it turned out I had moved in next door to the operations and training officer of the remote viewing unit, and across the street from one of their remote viewers in training. Of course, I had no idea what they did because this is a very highly classified program back then. Mm-hmm. But they apparently were watching me. They had a contract with the organization that had gotten into this field. SRI International, it used to be Stanford Research Institute, massive think tank and research agency out on the West Coast. So they had a contract with SRI to train some more remote viewers, and they were looking around in their circle of friends and acquaintances and other people who they were able to screen out of the population to see who might be good. Apparently, they've been watching me. I had no idea I was under consideration. And one day, they came, knocked on my door and said, "Hey, we think you might be good at what we do." And I said, what do you do? And they said, we can't tell you. And I said, how do I know if I'd be good at it or not? They said, well, we have some tests we want you to take, and if you score roughly where we think you're going to, we will then bring you over to our offices and read you on, and then you'll have the opportunity to agree to volunteer or not. So they gave me a bunch of psychology tests, personality profiles, most of them pretty conventional. A couple of them were specially designed for the program, but didn't give anything away about what it was they did. And apparently I scored where they wanted because they took me over and read me on. One of them, Tom McNair, sat me down at a table in the back room and said, okay, I had to sign this really incredible NDA, non-disclosure agreement. It was worse than anything I'd done for even top-level security clearances. And then he said, what we do here is we collect intelligence against foreign threats using a parapsychological discipline known as remote viewing. We essentially are asking you to volunteer to become a psychic spy. And I was both dumbfounded and absolutely excited. I have to give you a little background here. As a kid growing up, I loved to read science fiction that involved extrasensory perception. Andre Norton wrote books about psychic animals, and Zena Henderson had her stories about a psychic alien race that was living on Earth, looked just like humans. I ate those up. I thought they were really cool. But then I'd been involved in a science fair project in junior high school, which had totally failed. I had absolutely no success with it. And I concluded at that point that there was nothing to this. It was a nice thing to write fiction about, but it really didn't work. Of course, that was a very unscientific judgment anyway, but nonetheless, I was a junior high student. What do you think, right? So as he's telling me this, what they're doing, my brain is going, you used to be interested in this stuff. Then you decided it didn't work. He's telling you that the U.S. government actually has a line item in the budget that pays people to learn this. And I said and I thought that means that there must really actually be something to it. And so I decided, within just a few seconds, I decided there's no way I'm not going to volunteer for this.
Oh, brilliant. Yes. This was, 1984-ish, I think, was this?
It was, the summer of 1983.
Who were the people who were training you? Or
So remote viewing was originally created, and early development was by a guy named Ingo Swann. He was I don't want to say struggling artist, but he was an artist in New York City. He'd grown up in the West. He'd done a tour in Korea with the U.S. Army. He'd worked at the UN as an administrative person, and then he decided, the UN job was to help him his day job as he was becoming an artist.
Yeah.
But he also was very interested in ESP research because he'd had some out-of-body experiences as a child. So he was working with this, of course, in the 70s is when this was going on, early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. That was kind of the heyday of ESP research. That's before the mainstream science got so biased against it. And there was a bunch of it going on in New York, in incredible institutions. And so he participated in that research. I won't tell the whole story because that could go on for the whole length of your podcast. But he ultimately got together with a physicist named Harold Puthoff. We call him Hal. So Hal Puthoff, who actually was one of the pioneers in laser research, is fairly noted in the field for his development in laser science. But they got together at SRI, had a successful experiment that attracted the attention of the CIA, which at that time was anguishing a bit over what the Russians were up to. The Soviet government was pursuing what we would call psychic or psychical research at a much higher order than we ever did. They were spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year, not rubles, but dollars a year, In 1 year, they spent 10 times what we spent over the entire 23 years the remote viewing program existed. So they were very serious about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, their area is a bit broader, but the CIA was excited to find somebody who was a credible scientist actually looking into this, and they contracted with SRI for the next 20 plus years to research it. And then along the way, the Army, and then the Air Force and the Army, and then Defense Intelligence Agency, all these folks came on board managing the program. So those were the folks that trained me, Puthoff and Swan, with Swan being the primary instructor, trained me and my fellow, the 5 or so folks that the Army had trained by SRI. And so, you know what, I think I've wandered away from your question. Maybe I didn't answer it. I don't know. You'll have to tell me.
No, you're there. How you started your training and who it was with.
Yeah.
You then presumably reached a point where you could start working as an operative, I suppose. Do you focus your mind on a subject, or do you leave your mind open and subjects that you remotely view come in, or how do you sort of focus it?
So this is probably one of the more mind-blowing aspects of an already mind-blowing topic here. A remote viewer is given a specific assignment to remote view a certain location or a certain event or a certain person, whatever the target might be. However, they are not told what it is they're remote viewing. So I like to use the example of the Eiffel Tower. So let's say you're in a training situation in remote viewing, and we used to practice a lot on geographical kinds of targets like the Eiffel Tower or the Empire State Building or Mount Kilimanjaro, things like that. But let's say the target is the Eiffel Tower, okay, and your trainer, who is also the tasker, the one giving you the assignment, wants you to remote view the Eiffel Tower to see how well you can do that. Mm-hmm. They don't tell you to remote view the Eiffel Tower. What they do is they give you an arbitrary number, and I always use the number 8675309 as my example. They might give you the number 8675309, and that's all you get. You don't know consciously that it's Eiffel Tower. You don't know even consciously that it's even a structure or what. You're just totally blind to this target. And somehow your subconscious decides, okay, 8675309, what is that linked to? And so your subconscious goes out and tries to find out what that number connects with and discovers, oh, it's the Eiffel Tower, and then it leads you through the process. So I like to say in remote viewing, you have to be psychic in 2 different ways. The first one is the most obvious way, which is you have to kind of clairvoyantly perceive the intended target and describe it and sketch it and tell folks what it is you're perceiving. But the other way is you actually have to then be psychic in terms of finding out what the target is in the first place, because you're not told. You're not told at all what the target is for a number of good reasons.
Those numbers, say, if you were given numbers, those are enough when you've been trained to trigger your remote viewing research.
Yeah, yes. That is sufficient. There's a whole lot more speculation as how exactly that works I could go into, but I think it's sufficient for now just to tell you it really does work. I mean, I've done it literally thousands of times. I've trained literally hundreds of people to do it and seen them do it, if you counted them all up, literally thousands of times. Obviously, it doesn't always work. There's times when it fails, but I've seen it work so frequently, I don't even have any doubt about this working. Yeah. You'll get skeptics out there who'll say, oh, well, it's confirmation bias, or it's just the stacking effect, and all these explanations to why people fool themselves into thinking the ESP is real when it really isn't. No, I know all about those pitfalls, and I know that this, and we take measures actually to avoid those kind of things. And in fact, this still works, and we still have success at it. Sometimes it doesn't work, and we don't know why usually. Well, sometimes we do know why. Other times we don't.
Mm-hmm.
It's because ultimately we don't know the causal mechanism for this. And so you'd expect us to miss it every now and again because we don't know ultimately what makes it work in the first place.
Yeah.
So we optimize it as much as we can. But so anyway.
Yeah. No, I can understand why, you use something like numbers, because if I said, imagine the Eiffel Tower, well, you already know what it looks like. So it's hardly a mystery on that.
Yes. And that's the reason, of course, that you want to be blind, because if you already know up front what the target is, all the everything you know about will flood in.
Yeah.
And it may not actually be what they're looking for. They may look for something unknown about the target, and they don't want your brain functioning to be clouded by all of this stuff you already know. They want you to be blind so that you will be more likely to tell them what they don't already know.
Yeah. So the targets, can they be anything, both physical objects or even people?
Technically, yes. Technically, remote viewing presumably can be used to describe anything, even intentions and so on and so forth. Of course, the more ephemeral a target is, the harder it is for a remote viewer to access. So generally speaking, those are kind of off the table for the most part. As far as physical objects, physical and persons and even events past or to some degree future, all those are fair game. All those can actually be perceived by a remote viewer if they know what they're doing.
Okay, right. Now to get back to the sort of, if you like, the second part of the question asked a few minutes ago, you've got your target, you've been given the numbers, your brain is working out, your powers are working out what it is. So what's the sensation then? I mean, is it, to go back to our Eiffel Tower, that in your mind's eye you suddenly see this large metallic structure in the middle of Paris, or what?
It's kind of hard to describe, but I will do my best.
Yes.
Okay. So first off, you don't get, I won't say you don't, occasionally it does happen. You don't usually get a very strong, vivid image in your head of the target. In fact, quite frequently, those kinds of experiences turn out to be your analytic mind making up an answer to the question, and they usually end up being wrong.
Yeah.
Instead, real remote viewing data is kind of like a half-remembered memory. You know how when you have a memory from the past, it's sometimes kind of vague. And it's just sort of, oh yeah, I sort of remember having that experience or whatever, right? So it can be of that quality, but you also know intuitively this is not an actual memory that I've ever had. This is something new, and yet it has the quality of being an old kind of memory. And so you try and describe those experiences, and it starts off being kind of a sensory-based thing. Like you get impressions of colors, sounds, smells, even tastes. The fun thing about remote viewing is you can taste anything, even if it's not something you normally would try to eat, right? So all of these general sensory modalities, you get impressions or perceptions of these. And as you get deeper into the session, a session will last anywhere from about 15 to 20 minutes to maybe an hour or so. As you get deeper into the session, then they start to coalesce. You start to get a better concept of how things fit together. You start to get the feeling of shapes and forms. You start to get the feeling of things that are substantial and maybe not so substantial, like water versus metal versus land. Ultimately, you get to the point where you can sketch either the target or elements of the target. Sometimes you only get bits and pieces, which makes sense if you understand the perceptual elements and how human perception interacts with this very subtle signal that you're getting in the process. Ultimately, you get to the point where you might even be able to make a three-dimensional model of the target. We use clay, modeling compound, things like that for that. And sometimes you get some very striking representations. In the sketching part, I have sketched quite literal sketches of what the target turns out to be in a double-blind setting where I had no idea what the target was, and the person giving me the tasking also did not know what it was. A third person with whom neither of us had contact decided what the target would be, and yet I was still able to sketch a quite accurate representation of that target. And I've had students do the same thing. I've had colleagues do the same thing. It's quite interesting. The same thing applies to this three-dimensional modeling. Sometimes they only get part of it. If it was the Eiffel Tower, you might get the crisscrossing elements, for example. But sometimes those three-dimensional models are just stunning how accurate they are. And those kinds of things, you can't measure that statistically, but it's very obvious that the person who did it was being psychic in the process, that it didn't have anything to do with cheating or any of the other claims that people make about this.
So, again, appreciate you may not be able to answer this, but what sort of targets were you asked to look at when you were with the military, or was it purely just an experiment that was ongoing?
So you'll be pleased to know that if I tell you this, I won't have to kill you. So we addressed pretty much any target that was a concern to the U.S. intelligence community during the roughly 19 years that the military part of the program functioned. So, for example, one of the very earliest Army targets was what was inside a large structure in a shipyard in northern Russia on the White Sea. And nobody outside of the Russians appeared to know what was in there. And one of our remote viewers, as really his first ever operational target, accurately described what turned out to be the Typhoon submarine, even down to the point of indicating that the ballistic missile tubes were in front of the sail, or as people call it sometimes, the conning tower.
Yeah.
In other words, on the front part of the submarine, which was unheard of. That no other submarine has been built that way before or since. And yet this remote viewer, without any possible way of knowing anything about it, accurately described that submarine before it ever came out of that building, before it was ever launched. So we did those kinds of things. We did nuclear weapons testing. We tried to remote view Chinese tests and Russian tests, new weapon systems, hostages in the Middle East, the Bekaa Valley particularly, in Lebanon, narco trafficking. During the war on drugs, we had a role to play there. It was actually quite successful, in fact. Just about any question that an intelligence tasker may need to know, the intelligence analyst might need to know the answer to, we at one time or another were asked to address that kind of a target. And remembering, of course, that the viewers always were blind. We did not know what the targets were we were doing. And yet, through the mechanisms that were developed, we were able to, in many cases, successfully provide intelligence against these things.
Right. You mentioned earlier that some people in the scientific community are very skeptical and, regard it as just mumbo jumbo. What was the reception in the military about what you were doing? To go back to your guy with the Typhoon submarine, comes out with a report saying the Russians are building this giant sub with all the missile tubes in front of the sail. Did people take it seriously, or did they laugh, or what?
So that would depend. Overall, the military is actually very pragmatic. If it works, they don't generally care why it works, as long as it is providing legitimate information that they didn't have any other way. But sometimes, and depending on how political the food chain was through which it got passed, they may not take it seriously. The Typhoon submarine was not taken seriously, and 10 months later they took it way more seriously, because that's when the sub was launched finally. So that wasn't taken seriously because the person knew, the people who were being provided this product were also informed at the time what the source was. And they said, what? No, that can't be right. And then they just ignored it, right? So, and that's happened to me over the years too. We were asked at one point to try and find the remains of a missing U.S. soldier in Iraq. He'd been kidnapped by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and there was a real effort to try and find him. So we were asked to do it. We provided information that was consistent with the case, and all of my viewers were double blind on this. And nonetheless, they provided information that was absolutely consistent with the situation. But just like any other intelligence method, you tend to have to retask them for more detail. You get the general picture, and then you have them drill down. But the task force that was supposed to be finding this guy was provided our information and also told where it came from, and they would not even use it. They absolutely rejected it just because they didn't believe the source could provide anything credible, which was unfortunate, because I think we could have actually probably helped them solve that problem much sooner than they ultimately did. But, that's the way it goes. In general, in the military, we had people who were really strong supporters, and not just military, but civilian as well. And, of course, we had people who wanted to torpedo it because they didn't believe in it. In fact, that's why ultimately the program was canceled. In 1995, Congress directed they directed the year before. They directed that in 1995, the program be transferred from the military to the CIA. Well, it turned out the CIA was being led by a guy named, I want to say his name is John, first name, I always forget to look it up. Deutsch was his last name. Yeah. He was the director of the CIA, and he was totally opposed to anything having to do with remote viewing. People had tried to brief him in the past on remote viewing, and he would literally throw them out of his office before they were able to explain to him what they were doing. He had some kind of nuclear physics background or whatever, and he just was a hardcore physicalist, just couldn't accept the fact that remote viewing might all be real. And so that was the agency that they tried to transfer the program to, and surprise, surprise, the CIA just essentially canned the program. They took the slots and canceled the rest of it. So
you're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Going forward, what is the situation now? Has the military or the intelligence agencies taken more interest in it, or is it dead in the water as far as they're concerned?
Yeah, that's actually a mixed question. So from an official perspective, the military has no interest in it. The upper levels, the decision-making levels, the budgeting levels, now they're not even worried about it. They don't pay any attention to it. However, the mid-level folks are willing to give it a try. If they might have some contingency funding that they can dedicate to hiring remote viewers on a not even really a contractual basis, kind of an interim basis. That doesn't happen a lot now, but during the height of the war on terror, that happened from time to time fairly often. But anytime anybody tries to push it further up the bureaucratic chain, it gets killed, because the upper level bureaucrats are worried that might come back on them and undermine their careers, because people will laugh at them for having even considered this, right?
Right.
It's the standard thing. Don't try anything new. You might put your job in jeopardy. That's kind of it.
Yeah. Which, of course, brings us back to mainstream, in quotes, scientists, that they also tend to shy away from anything like that because it might not go down well with their colleagues. And
surprisingly, there's actually a sizable number of mainstream scientists who privately are interested in this and have dialogues and stuff with us privately, but in public they won't have anything to do with it for exactly the reason you said.
So the fact that you had demonstrable success, or the team had demonstrable success, that doesn't really carry any weight.
Not really. Because interestingly, the people who support it can point to the successes, but then the people who reject it will point to the failures.
Yeah.
Ironically, remote viewing is probably about as successful in an operational framework as most of the other intelligence disciplines. In fact, in the war on drugs, we were actually percentage-wise more successful than the other disciplines. But success isn't always the thing that people look at. It's more how it fits into their worldview, their paradigm, if you will. And in mainstream science, one reason ESP isn't accepted as real is because they don't have a theory that explains it. There is really a ton of actually really good evidence that there is a phenomenon there, and it proves successful in many settings and situations. But what we have is the evidence. We don't have a theory construct, an explanatory framework that puts it into the physical world.
Right.
And so mainstream will reject it. No matter how good your evidence is, if you can't explain it, then they're going to reject it.
Yeah. Yeah. So they're just going to say it's, luck or chance or coincidence or whatever.
Or fraud.
Or fraud. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Okay. What's either with you with the military or more recently, because obviously you have a continuing interest in it and you've written books about the subject and you're involved with the general promulgation of the concept of remote viewing. What's the weirdest remote viewing experience you've had?
Well, I guess weirdest would be, so I'll back out a little bit.
Yeah.
When you're using a methodology that so far we can't explain how it works, the temptation then, and a methodology that, by the way, can seem to access things that normally can't be accessed by our physical means.
Yeah.
So the temptation then is to use it to explain or attempt to explain other weird phenomena, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's unfortunate, but remote viewing has, in the past few decades, gotten to the point where it's tied in too strongly, I think, with the UFO, UAP, ET phenomenon, if you will, as well. But that's not to say that if there really is some reality to UFOs, etc., remote viewing may not be able to. I mean, that was a weird sentence construct. So just because remote viewing has unexplainable elements to it, if there is a reality to UFOs, that doesn't mean the remote viewing might not be able to get actually legitimate data from legitimate UFO aspects, right? So one of the taskings I got, Ingo Swann, I mentioned, was the guy who trained me and my fellows in this. He would do projects on the side just out of curiosity oftentimes, and one time somebody asked him to remote view a specific area on the far side of the moon that they thought was suspicious. Now, at this point, as far as I was concerned, the moon was just the moon. All this talk about aliens and bases on the moon, all that kind of stuff, I thought it was just baloney. I've since found that there actually are weird things that happen on the moon that even NASA has documented, but we'll let that go. So Ingo asked me to do a project. He did not tell me it was the far side of the moon. I had no idea it was the moon. I was, of course, blind to the target. And in the process of this, I described this really bleak, kind of hostile sort of terrain without anything around. I don't recall where I noticed it had no air, but it was just really weird, bleak, barren terrain, totally devoid of plant life, all that kind of thing. But then I perceived an underground chamber, and that there was activity in this underground chamber. And in fact, out of the chamber, through a large opening, came this craft, the kind of a flying object in a way, that under normal circumstances, was kind of manta ray shaped, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. But I perceived this thing as perceiving me, and that was weird because I didn't recall ever having that happen before. And it felt like it was part biological and part artifactual. So in other words, partly machine, partly living organism. And this is long before Battlestar Galactica and Stargate SG-1 came up with these ships, these vessels that were part biological, part artifactual. This is long before those. I'm having this impression, and that was weird. I have to tell you, it was weird. Now, I'm not telling you that that thing exists. I've learned always to take remote viewing data with a grain of salt until I have some confirmation that what I perceived was real. But the experience was pretty convincing. And given that I was blind to the target and discovered afterwards that Ingo, in his own viewing, without any connection between me and him, had described something very similar, that actually makes me take it a little bit more seriously than just dismissing it out of hand. It was a very interesting experience, and I suppose meets your criteria of being the weirdest remote viewing experience I ever had.
Yeah, yeah. There's a phrase, I'm looking at some notes I've got here, you call remote viewing a martial art for the mind.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's apt. Now, I call it that. Somebody somewhere back in the past coined the term. I'm not taking credit for I borrowed it. It's what I did. I just don't remember who I borrowed it from. Martial art for the mind. If you think about a martial art, it's a very disciplined process. It's an art rather than a science, although there is some science that informs martial arts. It's a discipline. It requires a lot of practice. It involves leveraging capabilities you never knew you had. And to some degree, martial arts is actually a mental or a consciousness-based sort of an activity as well. It kind of marries the physical with the mental. And all those things could be said the same of remote viewing. Obviously, you're not using your body in the same way, but you do employ kind of a kinesthetic experience. That is, of course, muscle recognition, muscle whatever. Yeah. Folks can look up kinesthetic. Anyway, it is a kinesthetic kind of experience. And martial arts, of course, is a macro kinesthetic experience. So that remote viewing is more of a micro kinesthetic experience. When you're doing sketching, when you're making models, the information is actually flowing out from your subconscious into your hands, if you will, to create these things on paper. You're not really working from your conscious awareness, from your analytical mind. So there's a very interesting metaphor, maybe analogy between these two disciplines, remote viewing and, I don't know, say jiu-jitsu or karate or something like that.
You are described as being a CRV teacher, and you wrote a CRV training manual. What's the CRV bit then? Obviously RV is remote viewing, but there's the C bit.
Yes, so CRV these days stands for controlled remote viewing.
Right.
Originally, Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff developed this in response to the military requirement that they come up with some kind of training methodology to allow just, generally average everyday soldiers to be trained in how to become psychic spies. It used to be called coordinate remote viewing, but when it became public, Ingo Swann himself requested that we call it controlled remote viewing because he had generally wanted to call it that all along. The idea being that this is a psychic process that the individual, the perceiver, learns to discipline and control. So this is not just some kind of randomly psychic behavior. This is something you learn a process for and that you can manage what you're doing to some degree. So I teach that methodology that Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff developed, and I teach it about as authentically as it is taught out there. There are a lot of knockoffs and derivatives of CRV, some of them still called CRV, some of them have their own names, but they're all essentially derivatives of the original approach. I've tried to keep my approach as clean as possible and as true to the original as possible. And so, I teach that. Here in southern Utah, in what we call color country, it's absolutely gorgeous place here where all the massive sandstone, red and white and brown sandstone formations are, the arches, all of that. It's a gorgeous place to be, I have to tell you. Anyway, I teach it, and the manual I wrote, I was actually asked to coordinate the efforts of a number of all of us who had trained with Ingo to capture what we had learned in a kind of a festschrift, so I can't think of an English name for that, document the whole process. And so that's what I created, although I had a lot of people helping me do that. I won't say a lot, but at least my colleagues who were who are also proficient in this, helping me make sure it was as accurate as possible. And then we used that as a guide to train new recruits that we brought into the program. And ultimately, the manual escaped into the wild, and so it's out there. You can find it on the internet, and you can find derivatives of that manual out on the internet, and and so on. I do have a partial version of it on my website. People can go check it out if they want.
Yeah. One of your books is The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. Does that cover that?
It gives a description of it. The Essential Guide, the purpose of the Essential Guide is to act as a kind of a gateway for people who just now heard about remote viewing, never knew it existed before, and it's kind of, I guess, a survey course, if you will. It covers lots of topics like what is remote viewing, what are the different kinds of remote viewing, what are some of the skeptical attacks and the responses to the skeptical attacks. There's a couple of chapters on how to do simple remote viewings, how to find a good teacher, what you can do with remote viewing, and so on and so forth. It's a general overview. Right now it's only available in the United States, but I'm working on getting at least a Kindle version available in other English-speaking countries, and we'll see how that goes.
For someone who was interested and taking on board your caveat at the very beginning about learning to play the guitar or learning to play the piano or whatever, prepared to make the effort and to put in the time, how long would it take to become vaguely competent at remote viewing?
Vaguely competent, not very long. So my basic course, which gets you up to the point where you can sketch the target or parts of the target, and have a general perception and get a good idea of what it is. It's 5.5 days long, although they're pretty intense days. But people, even just learning it from a book or a website, can get to the point where they can at least have some reasonably good data, and depending on how long they practice it and to what degree they want to commit their time to it. I mean, that's always of course, the variable, isn't it? It's how long, not just learning the correct principles, but then how much time you're willing to devote to it on a daily or weekly basis to master it. And some people who can really concentrate on it will progress quite rapidly. Others may take quite a while because they only get around to it every once in a while.
I see from the notes that you've actually got a conference coming up in September, the IRVA conference in New York State, which presumably is going to be very novel.
Good day,
because you'll
gentlefolk.
Be meeting people face
I
to
doth
face,
have
which we haven't
breaking
done for
news.
18 months.
Your Weird Tales
That's
host,
right.
Charles Christian,
What
has written a new book
What
called
will that be doing? We'll put
Saints
links on the
and
website,
Sinners
but what
in
will
Dark Age England.
What will that be?
5 shocking true
IRVA
tales
is the International
that are
Remote Viewing
stranger than
Association,
fiction.
and I
There's
was one
murder,
of the founders back in
mayhem,
1999,
treason,
and I've been the
incest,
vice president and president of the
adultery,
organization
and worse.
on the board for
Read
years.
about
I am
the
now
real
retired
antics
from her,
of
but
9
so I get
saints.
to be an
Yes,
interested observer
saints,
and an interested
8
participant,
kings
but
and
not a
5
planner.
queens of
So
England,
that means
plus
I don't have to
the
worry like I used to have
wickedest
to
of all
worry.
stepmothers. And be amazed.
But the conference will be in
horrified,
Rhinebeck,
or
New York, at
appalled,
the Omega
or
Institute, which is
free.
a
If you love
quite
weird
famous
history, and methinks you do, hop over to Amazon for a
conference
copy
and
of
workshop
Charles
venue for
Christian's
people
Saints
interested
and Sinners in Dark Age
in
England.
these kind
Grab
of
yours
leading
now.
edge consciousness based topics. And so it will be there in I think it's the second week in September. Folks can go to the website irva.org and find out all about it and sign up. And I encourage you to sign up. I'm on the program. That may not be the reason you want to sign up, but hopefully my talk will be interesting. Right now, it looks like my subject matter is, can a machine remote view? So in other words, if we do succeed in creating true artificial intelligence, will it be able to become a remote viewer? I'm going to address that question in this at this conference. We'll see what answer I come up with. So so it's going to be great. The conferences are always good. I've planned probably 3/4 of the ones plan and organize 2/3 of the conferences that the organization has had in the past.
Yeah.
So I know how much work goes into it, and there's a lot of work going in to make this a great success. Very exciting place, lots of like-minded people coming together, sharing ideas. So yes, if anyone in your listening audience has the option of coming over in roughly the second week of September for this conference, I really encourage them to do it.
Excellent. And just sort of one final point before we wrap up. One of your other books is Reading the Enemy's Mind, which is obviously relating to your military and intelligence work. Where are other nations now? America, as you've said, seems to have thrown in the towel on it. What about the Russians, the Chinese, and obviously the North Koreans? Are other states still investigating it, as far as you know, obviously?
Yeah, that's an open question. I don't think the Russians are. They pretty much shut their program down right after the wall came down and the Cold War ended. Of course, at that time, they're very cash starved. They didn't throw any money at anything. They absolutely didn't need to. And I don't think they've come back. In fact, the former people who were involved in the Russian program have actually kind of gone public. And some of the folks from our program have gotten together and become kind of friends with the folks from their program, have been comparing notes. So that's kind of interesting. The North Koreans, I really doubt, are involved in it. The Chinese may be. Of course, you run into the problem in any Marxist society that they have a real difficult dealing with something that appears to be non-physical, at least in how it manifests, right? So, Marxism doesn't allow, everything in Marxism is physically based. So during the Cold War, the Russians had to essentially define remote viewing and other phenomena like that as psychoenergetics. There's some kind of energy in the mind that allowed this to happen, so they could get around that problem in Marxism. The evidence actually suggests that notion that it is energy based from the mind is probably wrong, and that would be a whole another podcast, yes. I guess. But nonetheless. The Chinese may be dabbling in this. There's some indication they might be. There's rumors that the Indians are, the East Indians. The Japanese actually were, but not in a governmental sense. Let's see now, which one was it? One of the big Japanese corporations, Sony, I think it was, actually had a psychic research program, believe it or not. And by the way, the UK actually did some research in this back in the early 2000s. MOD had a short, small program where they researched it. And I have to say, I think their research is well-intentioned, but having read now the reports that were released on it, they didn't know what they were doing. I don't think they did a very good job of the research. But, I don't fault them. In fact, I praise them for at least giving it a try, right?
Yeah.
But they just didn't consult the right folks and the ones they consulted gave them kind of bad advice. So anyway, there you go.
There we go. Right. And in the commercial world, is it being used?
Yes. Of course, with the typical caveats, mainstream business actually kind of keeps this at arm's length as well. But there are more forward-thinking businesses who've requested remote viewing support. Of course, you always have to keep it quiet. You always sign non-disclosures on it. They don't want you talking about it. So consequently, I just have to say they're doing it. I can't tell you what they're doing.
Yeah.
Although in one case, actually, I did work a competitive intelligence project where one multinational thought another multinational had stolen their intellectual property. In fact, a technology for creating fiber optics. And I and my little group of viewers were asked and actually paid to remote view it and try and confirm. And apparently we did. I didn't get direct feedback on it. Of course, it's all proprietary, intellectual property stuff. But what I found out was that the company we were working for took the information we provided, confronted the other company, and they got all their lawyers together in a meeting, threw what we'd provided down on the table and said, this is what we know about what you guys are doing. And the other company immediately settled to the tune of several $1 million.
Oh, well, yeah.
So that's pretty good feedback.
That is, yes. Well, Dr. Paul, that's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you ever so much for your time, and good luck with the conference in September.
Thanks. I appreciate your good wishes. And you know what? Who knows? Maybe you'll show up. If you do, say hi.
I will do indeed. Thank you ever so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
England, home to zombies, werewolves, green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Newton Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com.
Once again, a big thank you to this week's guest, Dr. Paul Smith. As ever, we'll have a full list of website links in the podcast metadata on our Weird Tales Show YouTube channel and on the urbanfantasist.com website. However, here are a few links to start with. www.rviewer, that's R as in the letter, viewer, all one word, .com. www.guidetoremoteviewing.com and www.remoteperception.com. Dr. Smith also mentioned the 2021 IRVA conference, which takes place on September the 9th to the 12th at the Omega Institute in New York State. The URL for that is www.irva.org/IRVA-conference. And that's it. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you so much for listening in. Please join me again next week for more strange tales for strange times. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.